All right, so we're talking about employee handbooks today, essential compliance updates. And with all the changes in employment laws, keeping your handbook up to date is extremely important. So for those of you who are not familiar with MassPay, MP, we're a full service human capital management service company, and we offer a suite of products and services, including HR, payroll, benefits, administration, time and attendance, and compliance. We support our clients with cutting edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we really are wired for HR, and we help our clients succeed by tying their operations to their business goals. With that, I always have to do, oops, I went backwards, have to do my legal disclaimer, because especially today, we're going to be talking about employment laws. However, we're not attorneys and we are not espousing any legal advice. And I just realized that there's a little, I didn't notice this in the disclaimer. This was from another webinar that we did. I just updated it. But the information in here when we're talking about is we generally are talking at the federal level. Very important to pay attention to state and local jurisdictions to make sure you're up to date in the areas in which you operate. So right now, for today, we're going to talk about why you need a handbook, what you should include in it, some policies you should look to update for 2023, and the top 10 handbook mistakes to avoid. All right, so why do we even need a handbook? When I'm working with my clients, I tell them that a handbook is your leg to stand on. If you are going to take any kind of employment action because somebody has violated a policy, that stated policy in a handbook is your leg to stand on. It's your support if anybody files a claim of wrongful termination or anything like that. But beyond that, it really is a great way to introduce new employees to your organization. Specifically, telling them about your company mission, values, and culture, communicating expectations, showcasing company benefits. This is sort of a marketing tool too for your employees. And then you want to, again, ensure any kind of compliance with state and federal laws, because a lot of times these state and federal laws require you to provide notices. But when you look at the language in the laws, it says that as long as it's included in your handbook, and you distribute that handbook and update it annually, you are in compliance with those notice requirements. It's also a tool for managers. This is something that your managers should be looking to when an employee asks them a question or when they're taking any kind of employment action. It should be their guide. And then along that same line, it's going to ensure consistency and fairness. I will say that you can have a policy, but if you're not managing to those policies, you are putting yourself in a very challenging position. So it is really important to make sure that everybody is applying the policies consistently. It's also a go-to resource for employees. I know that a lot of employers just hand the book out, but they're not necessarily making it readily available to employees. So if you have an ability to do that, where they can really access it online at any time, it's really helpful. So if they get a jury duty notice, it's instead of having to bother you with, hey, do I get paid for jury duty? They can look it up in their handbook. Maybe they're going to be going, scheduling some surgery, and they're not sure what our leave policy is. Again, they can go to the handbook instead of bothering you. And then finally, it really does help defend against employee claims of discrimination, of unfair employment practices, of unfair terminations, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of reasons to have a handbook. All right. One thing to keep in mind on handbooks is that one size does not fit all. So often when we start to work with new clients, they'll have a handbook, but they got that handbook from the last place that they worked, or maybe they got it online, or from a friend who is in a similar industry. But you have to take into consideration your particular business, your demographic. So first and foremost is size and location. So the number of employees will generally trigger certain employment laws. For example, 6 or more employees in Massachusetts requires you to have a written harassment policy and distribute that policy annually. Excuse me. At the federal level, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, applies to employers with 15 or more employees. However, at the state level, that applies to employers in Massachusetts with 6 or more employees. So again, the number of employees will trigger different laws, and so will company locations. So I know that most of you are here in New England, but in case you have employees out of New England, it's important to make sure that you are checking the states in which you operate, and really not even just the states. Depending on what state you're in, there's a lot of local laws, municipalities, and cities that have their own versions of different employment laws. The other thing to consider is your industry. In a transportation industry specifically, whatever you have to comply with at excuse me, at the federal or state level in order to maintain that is something that might also need to be included in your handbook. If you're a government contractor, there's specific language and specific policies you have to have. And then also if you are unionized, there's certain language that should be in your handbook. And finally, you want to think about your workforce, the diversity, the employment categories, whether you have telecommuters, whether you have a team that maybe has either literacy or language issues, or maybe disabilities that you need to accommodate. So there's just so many factors that you need to consider when putting together your handbook. All right, so a few do's and don'ts when it comes to handbooks. So first, do put it in writing. I know a lot of employers will say, you know what, I don't want to have to be held to it, so I don't think I want to write it down. Well, here's the thing. If you don't write it down and you don't have a consistent policy, especially a policy for your managers to fall back on, you may be treating different employees differently with respect to, let's say, leaves of absence or taking sick time or anything that involves employment laws. And by not putting it in writing, you don't have anything to back you up. How do you say that the person didn't follow your policy if you don't have the policy written down? Secondly, is to apply the handbook policies consistently. This is where we see a lot of employers go in the wrong direction. They spend a lot of time and a lot of money creating a handbook, but then they don't manage to that handbook. They make a lot of exceptions, a lot of changes. And once you start being inconsistent with how you're applying those policies, this is where you can get into a lot of trouble. So for example, if you have a policy about attendance and you say that if somebody's been, let's say somebody's been late more than 6 times in a month, that you're going to write them up. And then maybe you have an employee who comes to you and says, listen, my bus route just changed. I really have no control over when I'm getting here right now. So you allow that person to slide. But then the other person, there's another person who's also having attendance issues and you're writing them up. That inconsistency in applying the policies can really come back and bite you. You do want to communicate your policies to everybody. Make it readily available. If you have a payroll platform or an HCM platform, let's say like we have here at MP with iSolve, we can actually upload it to the employee portal so that employees will have access 24/7. And do make it easy to read. A lot of times employers are putting in a lot of information maybe that employees don't need. You want to really differentiate between information that is employment related and information that is related to your procedures in the company. So it's not an SOP, it's not a standard operating practices kind of a handbook. It really should be anything regarding employment. And then a couple of the don'ts: don't get too detailed. So for example, in the handbook, you don't want to be too detailed, let's say in your benefit information, because if you are being too detailed, you want to make sure that employees are looking to the benefit summary description and not just at the handbook, because you may have missed a few things. You also will oftentimes have things that change pretty frequently. For example, something to do with your health plan, for example, you may have your costs in there, but those costs generally change annually. So we suggest not to get too detailed in that respect. And the other don't is don't treat it like an operations manual. Like I said, you really have to differentiate between employment practices and business practices. Those should really be two separate documents for your employees. All right, a few must-have at-will language, must-have is the at-will language. This is so important in the handbook. You really should have language that includes that the handbook is not a contract, that you retain the right as the employer to revise the employment relationship at any time, meaning that you can terminate that relationship at any time, and the employee can terminate the relationship at any time. The handbook, you want to state that the handbook is a policy guide only and can be revised at any time, and that any revisions will be communicated. What you don't want to do is include any kind of contractual language. So you want to avoid using terms that imply job security or guarantees. So for example, successfully passing your probationary period. So if we say that successfully passing your probationary period, you're going to get XYZ, maybe certain benefits or pay increases or ability to earn bonuses, any of those things. By using that language, you're implying a contract that as soon as they've hit that 90 days or whatever your probationary period is, they're now eligible for those things. And they may not be. So you got to watch that language. And things like long rewarding career with the company, you just want to avoid implying that their job is guaranteed. All right, use your handbook to tell your company's story. It's a great way to engage employees and really bring them into your company culture by really describing your culture, mission, goals, maybe a little bit of the history. Oftentimes, if you've got an interesting history, excuse me, you want to talk about employee relations policies, and then be aware of gender neutral language. Gone are the days that we say he, she. We really want to kind of make the language very gender neutral. Even when you're looking at things like handbook policies, you don't want to have a separate policy for men and a separate policy for women. You want to make sure that it is a policy for all genders. All right. And then what to include are compliance policies. There are a number of things that, well, let me start with this. You're not required to have a handbook by law, nor are you required to have certain policies in that handbook. But there are policies that we strongly recommend that you include in your handbook in order to protect you, again, from any employment claims. So those would be the EEO, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Policy, your policy on discrimination and harassment, drug-free workplace. If you are a federal contractor, you have to have a drug-free workplace policy. You want to have policies in regards to compensation, when they're getting paid, how they're getting paid, excuse me, and then also include safety. So especially in your particular industry, stressing safety, safe driving practices, adhering to city and state laws regarding driving, that kind of thing. Really important to have all those compliance type policies in your handbook. And one thing in regard to your workplace, your drug-free workplace policy, even if you don't have a federal contract and you're not required to have a drug-free workplace, it's really a good idea to have a policy that says that, things like medical marijuana or prescription medication are not allowed when driving a vehicle. Really important, again, in your industry. Okay, so now let's talk about workplace policies that you should include that are going to really be specific to your company. So you don't want anything too generic here. So things like attendance requirements, because for each industry, there's for each type of business, there are different ways that you want employees either to communicate when they're going to be out, or maybe certain guidelines as to how many days they can be off before they need a doctor's note to come back, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure that those attendance requirements are clearly outlined. Your standards of conduct and performance, you want to make sure that you include, you don't want to get too specific, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you have outlined what is acceptable and not acceptable in your workplace. Technology guidelines. If you have employees who are, let's say you give them a smartphone or you give them access to company information or company access to any kind of company information, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in that you want to make sure that is kept confidential. You want to make sure that they know what they can and cannot use that technology for. So for example, maybe in-house, I shouldn't be using it to, surf the web for, for theater tickets, or I shouldn't be using it to post things on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Pardon me. You do want to outline your benefit information. Like I said before, you don't want to get too detailed, but at the same time, you want to let your employees know what benefits are available, when they are eligible for them, and then basically who, when they become eligible and how much they may have to contribute, especially if you have a lot of benefits that you provide at no cost to employees. You want to make sure that's in your handbook as well. Another thing is handling confidential or sensitive information. Again, in the transportation industry, this is really important because, the type of clientele that you may have, handling that confidential or sensitive information can be really critical. And in addition to that, you have information on your customers or clients that you want to make sure that your employees aren't sharing. And finally, there should be an employee complaint process. Sometimes they used to call these open door policies. The funny thing is that there were actually court cases years ago that when managers were always in their office with the door closed, there wasn't a quote unquote open door. So employees didn't have an opportunity to complain about working conditions. So we advise against using open door policies, but you do want to make sure that employees know when there are concerns or issues, who to go to and in what order. So you want to maybe go to their immediate supervisor, but if they're not getting what they need, they either should contact HR or somebody else in management. Okay, so a few things to look at if you have in a handbook currently, a few things you want to look at to update for 2023. First is your EEO statement, that Equal Employment Opportunity Statement. Massachusetts in particular has had a lot of additions to their EEO and protected classes. And then if you are in multiple states, it's probably important to have separate EEO policies by state because different states have different protected classes. Workplace harassment. Again, this could be different by state. So if you're in multiple states, you want to make sure that you have that state-specific harassment policy. For example, in Massachusetts, you're required to have 2 names of people for employees to go to with a complaint. And it has to be a name with a phone number and email address, not just a position. And you also have to have the address of the EEOC and Mass Commission Against Discrimination. So those are requirements. Each state has their own requirements. So you may have multiple policies in your handbook based on the state in which the employees are working. Same goes for paid family and medical leave. There are so many states that have now put PFML in place. Massachusetts has had it in place now for a couple of years. New Hampshire is going to an optional PFML law that is going into effect January 1st. So again, these are important things to have in your handbook. A lot of states, again, have equal pay or wage discrimination laws that will then trigger certain notifications that you should have in your handbook. So, for example, in Massachusetts, our equal pay laws require that you have a wage transparency policy. You have to distribute that. Easiest way to do that is in your handbook. And finally, you want to also update your substance use or testing if you do drug testing, excuse me, of employees, because those are also changing as different states allow for medical and or recreational marijuana. So you want to make sure that those substance policies are up to date. Okay, so why are we even talking about all these things that could um, possibly need to be in your handbook? And it's because the EEO, who is the body that hears these discrimination claims at the federal level, these are numbers from, let me see, I'm trying to see, these are from fiscal year 2021. So this is, employees can file multiple complaints at one time. So somebody might say that they were discriminated against based on their age and color, and they've been retaliated against. So these numbers will include, they're not going to equal 100, because these numbers will include multiple claims. The biggest one is retaliation. And a lot of employers aren't aware that if you are terminating somebody because they've complained about a policy. So let's say, for example, somebody wants to take family medical leave, and then they are terminated, and you don't have a good reason for the termination. They can say they were retaliated against and terminated because they asked for a leave. And then there are times that employees will file a complaint with their employer, and then all of a sudden they find that they have a change in schedule, or a promotion that was denied, or an increase that didn't happen. All of those things fall under the category of retaliation. The next largest category would be disability. And included in disability would be things like mental health, as well as physical disabilities. Race, gender, age, national origin, color, religion are round out the top. And then there's the Equal Pay Act and genetic information that are claims that the EEO has heard in fiscal year 2021. So as you can see, there are tens of thousands of claims every year with the EEOC. Again, another good reason to have a handbook. Okay, another thing to take into consideration is workplace harassment. While it isn't necessarily in your handbook, we think it's worth mentioning that in addition to EEO and anti-harassment policies, there are 7 states and the District of Columbia that require training on the prevention of harassment in the workplace. Each state's slightly different when it comes to who is considered a covered employer and employee, and what has to be included in the content of the training. So for example, California employers with 5 or more employees anywhere, not just in California, must provide 1 or 2 hours of interactive training to their California-based employees, depending on whether they're an employee or a supervisor. Colorado, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont don't require training, but they encourage training. And this is a really important distinction, because here in Massachusetts, if you have an employee who files a claim against the company because the company didn't address a harassment issue, the first thing they're going to ask you is, do you have a stated policy? Do you distribute that policy annually, and do you train your employees? If you can answer yes to all 3 of those, you have what they refer to as an affirmative defense, meaning that if an employee quits and then files a claim against you because you didn't handle a harassment claim, that you can go in and say, listen, we have a policy, we distribute it every year, and we do training with our managers and employees, but this employee left and never let us know what was going on. This will help you in a discrimination claim or harassment claim. So it is really important to do those trainings at minimum with your managers, because you want to make sure, especially again in your industry, you have people, that are, you might have an employee of color who's driving, and a customer who is maybe abusive, verbally abusive to them, derogatory comments based on their ethnicity or their race or national origin. It's really important that those employees know what to do and who to talk to. It's even more important that your managers know that if an employee says, listen, I had a problem with this customer and it's a regular customer, you want to make sure that your managers know not to just brush that away, not just say, hey, listen, it's just something you got to grin and bear, or you're being too sensitive about it. Your managers really need to report that to the leadership team, the business owners, senior managers, because that is something that can be very costly to you in the long run. All right, let's see. And again, lots of leave laws coming in. So we've got the Federal Family Medical Leave Act, which applies to employers with 50 or more employees, but many states, a number of states already, and the District of Columbia have some version of a paid family and or medical leave law. And a lot of those are triggered by different levels of different number of employees. Many of them are haven't gone into effect yet, but they will be soon. So really keep that in mind. Make sure you're aware of those paid family and medical leave laws, and make sure your managers know that when an employee is requesting leave and you're in a state that has a leave law, that the managers really need to know how to handle that. All right, and then there are paid sick laws. They're just popping up all over the country. Many states already have required paid sick leave laws in place, but in addition to those states, many counties, municipalities, and cities also have paid sick laws. It can get really tricky trying to make sure that it's very hard to find to put together a policy that will cover all states. So you really need to sort of look at each of the states and areas that you operate in, that you have employees working in. You don't need to have an office there. Just an employee working in that state means that you have to comply with those paid sick laws. If you're in New York, you also have laws in New York City as well. Philadelphia has separate from Pennsylvania. So it's really important to be aware of all of those state and local laws. And then the equal pay and wage discrimination. So many of those laws are gender-based wage discrimination laws, but even though they are specific, an employee can file a claim because they feel that they've been discriminated against with their wages based on their gender. But it's also important to kind of look at it holistically as well and make sure that your pay is really equitable amongst all employees, regardless of gender, race, religion, ethnicity. Wage transparency, like I mentioned before, Massachusetts requires you to have a wage transparency policy in place. Wage transparency laws also prevent you as the employer from telling employees they cannot discuss wages. Employees have the right to discuss their wages here in Massachusetts. And if you have a policy in your handbook that says that they cannot discuss their wages, or that they'll be disciplined or terminated for discussing wages, is going to be a violation of those laws. And then the other one is the salary history ban. This is really important, again, especially if your managers are doing interviewing and hiring. Massachusetts is one of many states that has a salary history ban, where you cannot ask an employee about their salary history on the application or during the interview process. And some go as far as to say that you also have to post your compensation in your job posting as well. So again, very important to know what these laws entail, and very important to make sure that your handbook complies with these laws. All right, so substance use and testing, as I mentioned before, it is, so many states, this chart will show you excuse me, currently, and this is actually probably subject to change because there's a few states that have marijuana laws on their voting on them on the elections next week. But you can see the number of states that have medical marijuana laws, and then some that have medical and recreational marijuana laws. So it is important now, because you're in the transportation industry, of course, you've got to take, OSHA considerations in mind and any other transportation regulations that you have. But at the same time, you need to make sure that if, let's say you're required, that say you do drug testing, but you're in a state that says you can't discriminate against anybody based on their off-duty use of marijuana, then you may need to screen out marijuana when you're doing your drug testing. So again, really important to know what these laws are, and they are so different state to state. Sometimes it's like we're in 50 different countries here, and you really have to pay attention to that, because it's really easy to step on little landmines when it comes to these laws. All right. So before we get into the top 10 handbook mistakes, any questions that you want to ask while I take a sip of my drink here? No, I'll take that as a no. All right. So let's talk about some of the top 10 mistakes. Uh-oh, what happened? Oh, there we go. All right. Policies not matching your practices. I cannot tell you how many times that I have worked with a client, and they'll send me their handbook, and then I find out that let's say their PTO policy or vacation policy is totally different in their handbook than how they are administering it in real life. So you want to make sure that your policies really one that I find all the time is in annual reviews. A lot of employers will put a policy in place that they say that they do reviews annually. But then when I ask them, do you do reviews annually? They say, well, we try to, but we don't always. Well, if you terminate somebody because of poor work performance, and your handbook says that you do annual performance evaluations, but you're not doing them, the employee can say, listen, nobody ever talked to me about my performance. So again, really important to make sure that your policies and practices match. Secondly is failing to train managers and supervisors. For those of you who are business owners, this is absolutely critical. I think that this is the biggest opportunity and the biggest liability that a lot of employers have, because if your managers and supervisors aren't administering these policies consistently and fairly, you will absolutely not be able to defend yourself in discrimination or employment law claims. Restrictive social media policies. Again, this is really important. The National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, has really attacked these social media policies, because you cannot say that employees can't post things about their workplace, because under the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act, employees have the right to complain about their working conditions. So if an employee is posting things on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram about their working conditions, that is protected activity. So you want to make sure that your social media policy does not restrict that. That's just one example. You really want to make sure that you are revising your handbook and that policy regularly, excuse me, because those policies will update based on case law. So once a case has been brought to the EEOC or here in Massachusetts to MCAD, a lot of times these policies are going to change based on the results of those cases. Next up is not revising the handbook regularly. Again, this is so important. At minimum, it should be done annually. You should look at it, not just for laws that have changed or things that you need to add in, but also revising it to look at some of your policies and make sure that they are consistent with the practice, like we said in bullet point number 1. So if you start looking through it and say, you know something, maybe this is not how we've been handling certain things, we need to revise those policies. Failing to include required policies. Again, I'll put the, I'll say required sort of in quotes, because nothing is actually required. But what is required are notices, depending on the state or at the federal level, that you can use your handbook as the vehicle to distribute those notices. So instead of giving somebody, when they start, 6 different things that they have to sign off on from the state, it's just as easy to give them a handbook that will include all of those things. So making sure that those are all in there. Again, talking about that one size fits all approach. I really will encourage employers sometimes to have multiple handbooks depending on their business. So let's say, for example, you have different policies for time off for your drivers than you do for your office and administrative staff. Sometimes that warrants maybe 2 separate handbooks. That's absolutely fine. You want to make sure, maybe your office and administrative staff get paid holidays, but maybe your drivers don't. And maybe you don't want to make your drivers aware that they're not getting all these lovely benefits. So having 2 separate handbooks can be helpful. But just remember that one size does not always fit all. Overly detailed discipline procedures. This is one of my pet peeves. I have a lot of clients, when I start working with them, they'll have policies that say, if you are out, more than 3 times, you're going to get a verbal warning, and 3 more times, you're going to get a written warning. And then, so on and so forth. Once you really outline a specific discipline procedure, if you're not following that procedure to the letter, you now have inconsistent application of those policies, which again could lead to claims of discrimination. So it's really important to just say that if you want to have a discipline policy, to just say that disciplinary procedures can include verbal and written warnings, as well as suspension and termination, but not get specific. You want to be able to handle any disciplinary issue based on its own merit, right? If an employee has a verbal altercation with a customer, for example, but that customer really was the instigator of it, that's different from an employee saying things to another employee that was inappropriate, that you might terminate them for. So just leave it at the fact that having a very detailed, specific discipline policy holds your feet to the fire, and you may not want to do that. All right, omitting at-will statement and disclaimers, so important. Beginning of that handbook, it should reiterate that nothing in the handbook will override that at-will employment relationship. And you want to make sure, like we spoke about before, not to have any language that would imply anything contractual. And then you want to have, disclaimers. So for example, in your policies regarding any company benefits, let's say 401k, medical benefits, dental, vision, anything like that, you want to make sure that it says that, that the plans are based on the summary plan description, so that that's a disclaimer that says that this is what we're following today, not what's in the handbook. Using a boilerplate handbook. I mentioned that earlier. Again, so many times people will just take a boilerplate handbook and put it in there and not look at all the details. You really want something custom to your business based on its size, its location, the number of employees, and the type of policies that you have in place. And finally, failure to distribute the handbook. I will tell you that I've been with MP now for almost 7 years, and I have clients that I'm still working on their handbook. They just can't get it together. We work on it, we work on it, we work on it. It's never going to be finished, I swear. But it's a matter of making sure that if you're going to bother having a handbook, get it distributed. Make sure people get it, and make sure they sign a receipt or acknowledgement that they received it. Again, that is really going to help support you if you have any claims of discrimination or problem employment practices. All right. So that sort of brings us to the end. Any questions, burning questions that came up? Nope. Rick, Zachary, nothing? All right. Well, listen, it's been a pleasure. I hope you got something out of this, and we will send you a link to the recording so that you can share it with your folks. Thanks for joining us today.